There is a workout style that many CrossFitters are neglecting to put into their training that is one of the most effective at creating that pain cave and maximal mental toughness stimulus in workouts. Now, before I get into mental toughness workouts, when to use them, how to use them, data on them, it is a concept that is extremely important in terms of separating performance in elite CrossFit. I've coached multiple games athletes, and really all things being equal, mental toughness is one of the major things that separates them from the rest of the pack. They're willing to push through their discomforts in day-to-day disciplinary training, just doing the work when they're tired. In competitive settings, they're able to bring out maximal efforts when their bodies are sore and beat up and tired. So it is a major differentiating variable of success amongst the best. But that is partially because they're super strong, they're super enduring, they're super skilled, and they built this foundational base of strength and endurance and skill that allows mental toughness to be the differentiator. For people that are on their developmental path, mental toughness is not going to be the differentiator of success. If you can't do muscle ups and a muscle up workout comes out, it doesn't really matter how mentally tough you are. You're gonna get slowed down and bottlenecked by your lack of strength or your lack of skill. But it is almost certainly going to be something that separates on the leaderboard in one workout of the open or one or two workouts of the quarterfinals. And the reality is CrossFit is a very pain-intensive sport, so mental toughness is one of the most important things that you are going to need to train if you aspire to be competitive. So let's talk about today the style of workout that people are maybe missing that can elicit this kind of mental toughness development in their training. So most people in a CrossFit setting spend a bulk of their training, I put 80 to 90% of their conditioning, in the standard AMRAPs and for time. So these are kind of our time priority and our task priority workouts. It's what they teach in the level 1. It's what people are really commonly familiar with. There then is like EMOMs, and most of the time EMOMs are used, it's every minute on the minute. They're usually used as basically just interval tools. Every minute on the minute, 3 muscle ups, or 30 double unders and 3 muscle ups. And it's usually used as a tool to increase skill volume and accumulation in a non-intense setting. However, there is a version of these EMOMs or these kind of interval-based time windows that have come from the strength and conditioning community, bled into early days CrossFit, bled into competitive CrossFit, that now we are kind of learning how to use and model into training to effectively push people into those mentally tough pain cave type situations. So the strength and conditioning workout that kind of inspired this all is called a beep test. In a beep test, you have a specific distance you gotta run, and you have a timer that is beeping on a specific time window. You run down and back within that time window. If you do it and you beat the beep, then you unlock the next interval where the beep then happens a little bit faster. So it ends up being run, okay, beep's getting faster, run faster, okay, beep's getting faster, and you continue to do that, moving faster, basically until you fail. Now this failing concept in this interval time window kind of led into early days CrossFit and use of these workouts called death bys. In a death by workout, it's kind of a variation of an EMOM. You start the workout out and you do 1 rep or 10 reps or whatever the actual number you want to start with is. And then every minute you move forward, you add a rep to that until you fail. So in this structure, every single interval, you're working for a longer period of time and getting less rest as you have to go into the next set. So it has this progressive ramp up in terms of fatigue until you're at the point that you're getting into maximal failure. These workouts were often used with Olympic lifting movements like death by clean and jerk at the Grace weight was a very common one, or death by muscle ups is a very common one that was used in early CrossFit. And I think that inspired in 2014 and 2019, open style workouts that had this kind of like time unlock system where you do an amount of work and then you unlock into the next time window a new set of workouts, or a new set of work, not workouts. In 19.2, the work that you were doing within that time window changed only in that got heavier. It wasn't more work that you did, and the time window didn't condense. In 14.2, you were actually increasing the amount of work when you were going from window to window within the workout. So in both of those, there's a little bit of a different structure than a traditional beep test, but the concept is basically the same. You're doing work. If you do that work successfully and you make it through the window, you go into the next iteration. So that kind of inspired us to create a version of this that maximally elicits pain cave, mental toughness type stimulus. And in our current cycle, we modified this concept to build one of these that we thought was effective for this time of the year for kind of all athletes, regardless of skill level, whether they were the highest level athletes or people that are just aspiring to make it to quarterfinals. So in the workout that we did in our current cycle, which we have a video on and you could watch the actual demo, we created a beep test variation that started with 10 lateral burpees, and then you had to do a 500 meter or a 450 meter row. And you had a time window to complete that work. The first time window was 4 minutes, and then every single window after that, you reduce the time that you have by 10 seconds. So in interval 1, you're at 4 minutes. By interval 8, you only have 2 minutes and 50 seconds to do that work because the time is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, but the work is staying the same. So we're gonna come back, we'll talk about the data and what I'm gonna display from the demo that we showed on YouTube and kind of where quarterfinal threshold athletes would be based on our test and our training cycle. But before I get into that data, I wanna talk to you about why these are most effective for eliciting mental toughness. Now, that concept of mental toughness is often, I think, overused in the fitness space. And there are a lot of ways that you could build mental toughness. Martial artists are really tough at being able to take impact, but that mental toughness doesn't help you in CrossFit because you're not judged on whether or not you can take a hit and continue to fight. David Goggins is super tough if he's going to run an ultramarathon, but if he has to do thrusters and handstand walks and skills that he hasn't trained, then mental toughness that he has cultivated is not really practical and useful for the sport that we're talking about. So I wanted to create a little bit of a definition for mental toughness in the context of CrossFit racing. And I thought an easy way to articulate it is this is basically just having the ability to move fast when you're tired. That is at a simple level basically what people are saying when they're saying they're mentally tough in CrossFit. It's like you're on an echo bike, your heart rate's at max, your legs feel like they have cement in them, you feel like you're gonna poop your pants and throw up, but you gotta be able to continue to move the pedals fast if you wanna do well. That's the mental toughness concept that I think is actually practically useful for being a better athlete within the sport. Now, to do it, it's not just so much like, pushing somebody through pain and yelling at them through a finish line. There are actual systems in your body that develop and adapt through training that build mental toughness. And as a coach, I try to build progressive models of training and education that allow people to build those systems. Now, in order to kind of educate this in a simple way, I think of those adaptations as basically split. They're split between things that happen in your mind and your thinking and your body. Like your actual body has to adapt to training. And this is where the concept of corpus and animus, which is the name of the podcast and on our company seal, came from. Is all training, all sport requires you to adapt both your mind and your body to the specific task. So in an energy system type task, like a CrossFit workout, you basically have 4 main trainable systems that you're working to improve to be able to continue to work when you're really, really, really tired and at your limits of training. You have your muscular system. Basically, can your muscles do the actual work? If you're on a rower, can they pull? Can you push yourself off the ground in a burpee? Can you jump over the rower? Do your legs have the juice and the oxygen to pull on the rower? Then you have your cardiovascular system. So let's just say your heart and your breathing together. You need to be able to regulate CO2 and O2. You need to be able to maintain higher heart rates. You potentially need to, in a CrossFit workout, pump against a pressure gradient of muscular tension. And all of these adaptations will continue to allow you to work when you are tired because your body is adapting to have the ability to continue to move fast when you're tired. And the final one, which is my ugliest drawing, is basically your nervous system. So this is basically your ability to coordinate complex motion while you're under fatigue. So I'm sure you've seen somebody in the middle of a workout kind of drunken bearing where they can't even coordinate and move general walking, let alone a handstand walk or a burpee where it's more complex. So the interaction of all of these things in a specific workout are going to dictate whether or not you're at your limit in any of them where you have to slow down. Certain workouts are going to elicit different ones differently. So in an example, let's say my Metcon for the day is 100 strict handstand push-ups for time. If you do that workout, it's going to put a lot of demand on your muscular system, your ability to stay nice and tight in your midline, your triceps being able to extend, your upper back being able to stabilize your scapula to press, and it's just one repetitive motion with a low cycle rate over and over and over again. So it's probably going to tax the muscles and maybe the nervous system a little bit more. If I then say, all right, our workout for the day is a 1 mile time trial, that is most likely going to put a lot of pressure on the cardiorespiratory system. It's high impact, it's high turnover, people are going to start running and heart rate is going to spike and get up pretty quick, so it's going to put a lot of pressure on the cardiovascular system. When you are trying to do pain cave style workouts, the way I think of it is you are trying to elicit maximal stimulation of all of those bodily things. You want to get all of the muscles to be able to be taxed, so you need a lot of repetitive motion. You need the cardiovascular, meaning like your heart and your peripheral capillaries and all of that stuff to be challenged. You need your breathing to be challenged, so you need the cycle rate high, and you need your nervous system challenged. So when we created our workout, what we did with this was try to make sure we have compound movements to challenge the nervous system, high cycle rate with the rowing to challenge the heart and the lungs, and the muscles are going to be taxed because it's very repetitive. If somebody's doing this workout and they're going through 13 rounds, they're doing 130 burpees and a lot of rowing, which means the muscular system in those patterns are getting a lot of overload. So when you're writing and constructing these workouts that allow people to go faster when they're tired, the best way to train the mental constructs of that are to elicit the most types of tired at the highest levels in a workout. When you do that, the mind is basically learning how to adapt to that. I'm sure when you're in a workout, get to a certain level of pain, fatigue, you're breathing heavy, your brain's like, oh my God, I can't take this anymore. Oh, I can't do another one. Where's the time? It starts to get distracted and take away from your ability to focus on the work when you're uncomfortable. And in order to create those mental adaptations, you need exposure in that type of a fatigue setting. So you need to be able to elicit maximal fatigue. So now that we kind of understand like, okay, what needs to happen in the body to elicit that mental toughness thing, let's talk about why specifically this beep test style concept is better at eliciting maximal efforts of stimulation in these systems than a normal for time or AMRAP setting. Okay, so right here I have two charts. On both of the charts, I am basically explaining two things. One, with my purple line, is the output that you're gonna go in a workout. So if this were a bike, it would be like the amount of watts you're holding. Or a rower, it's like, okay, what's your pace per 500 meters? And the red line is a reflection of what happens to people's heart rate. And we're just gonna use heart rate as a simple proxy for effort in these style of workouts. If somebody is doing a for time or an AMRAP workout, and they're a typical CrossFitter, they're pretty heavily muscled, they're not super high level endurance athletes that are doing 15 hours of zone 2 a week to have great cardiovascular systems. They're strong and their fast twitch fibers are developed, so they have a lot of tension that they can create when they move. So their heart rate mechanics look a little bit different than if you took an endurance athlete and said, hey, go run a 2 mile. What normally happens, if let's say this is 160 calories for time of a row. If I'm gonna do that and I'm gonna coach somebody to do that, you know that they're pretty much gonna try to even the workload out across the whole thing. You're not gonna tell them get on and switch at full speed on the rower and get it to max effort right away and then hang on. You know that if that happens, their power output's gonna go up, they're gonna crash, and they're gonna be at this minimal petering pace through the finish line. And that's usually what happens with beginner athletes before they learn. As people get more advanced, they start to learn this kind of pacing of like, okay, this workout is potentially gonna take me 10 minutes, so I'm gonna manage my effort over the course of 10 minutes, and at the end, I'm going to kick. And what happens with most CrossFitters is you have a pretty big spike of heart rate up near max, and it will climb really quickly, like maybe within 90 seconds or 2 minutes of that test. Once it starts to crest near where the maximal oxygen consumption they can handle is, like where their VO2 max is, generally speaking, in an untrained endurance athlete who's also heavily muscled, the heart rate will deflect a bit from that point, and then it'll be very chaotic and kind of meander close to where their threshold is, and then at the end, they'll push themselves up and finish the workout, usually fall on the floor and gasp for air. So the heart rate basically spikes, drops a little bit, and it peters out. What happens with an elite endurance athlete, if they were doing the same test, is the workout has a steady creep and it gets up near that VO2 max point that we talked, that max heart rate point, and they can hold it steady along that line. Now, it's not really possible to do in heavily muscled CrossFitters who are doing complex workouts, but this type of workout actually doesn't really elicit zone 5 max effort cardiac stimulation as well as a beep test. What a beep test does is it takes the work curve and instead of being flat, it starts very slow and it gets faster as you go through the workout because you have to go faster to beat the time window that you're facing. But it also slows down in the beginning. So what it does is it allows the heart rate to slowly and creep up progressively, kind of similar to how an endurance athlete would feel going through a similar test. But then as they get to the second half of the test, it accelerates where you're going faster than your sustainable output. So your heart rate will start to spike and it will stay spiked because you're using fast twitch muscle fibers and all of that power that's built in CrossFitters, and it drives them up into a higher state and a higher sustainable state of heart rate, and I'd call it just general fatigue. So the reason why, or maybe just one reason why this is so much more effective is basically that you can basically spend more time at zone 5 or more time in the pain cave in this style of workout than if you do a 4-time or AMRAP, which maybe sounds like hearsay because it means a 4-time or AMRAP is less intense because you're not actually able to push intensely for 10 to 12 straight minutes. So that is why these tests are so effective at making people maximally fatigued, therefore building their mental toughness. Now, we'll talk about the data and kind of what the best way to do it is and how to interpret these results. But prior to doing that, I just want to talk about the mistakes that I've seen people make with these styles of workouts, or just mistakes I'd like you to avoid if you're going to integrate these into your training. And I basically have 4 of them with a little kind of tip into how to integrate them a little bit more efficiently. So first is make sure that they are not super high skill or load dependent. So the tests that we talked about up here, 19.2, they get really heavy in the end intervals. So most people are not really going to be limited by their muscles or their hearts or their lungs if they're fit enough to get into their later work thresholds. Their nervous system and their ability to coordinate high levels of power when they're fatigued is going to be the major differentiator. So it's not necessarily mental toughness that stops them. So if you do a high skill movement like that or a very heavy load, you take away that kind of pain stimulus. So when you do it, you want the movements still to be compound, but you want them to be repetitive and fast. So if we circle back to this test that we described, very simple movements, very high cycle rate, very repetitive. So that's why they can elicit that maximal pain cave type response. Next is that they don't do retests. And I know why, because this type of test is very painful. When you do it, almost everybody is going to get into a specific part of the workout where you're right up against the interval. And when you're at your maximal level of tiredness, you got to sprint just to meet the interval. And what happens when you meet the interval? You get the surprise of doing another interval after you just sold out just to make that interval. So when people do that, they're always or very often like, oh my God, that was so bad. I can't do that any better. And if you do it, the progress is so much smaller than if you did something like an AMRAP where you got a whole nother round, you're getting so much more and it feels so much better than doing a lot of work for being like, man, I got one more window in, or I got 10 more calories on my last row. So people avoid the retest. I would say if you are trying to build mental toughness, you need to expose yourself to those retests because you need to be mentally tough to know, oh my God, this is gonna hurt really badly. I might not get any better at it, but I'm gonna do it. So when we put this test into our training program, we actually anchored it into a test-retest format where we're running progressions on it through the weeks so that people can be ready to face that kind of gross stimulus you're gonna get in your first run through of this workout. So make sure if you are putting these in your training, you are putting some test-retests and actually seeing data-driven progress, not just writing a workout just to see if it could be painful and train your mental toughness, but also that you are using it as a tool for progress, which is the ultimate outcome of an athlete. You're not only trying to be tough, you're trying to actually make yourself quantifiably better at your sport. So make sure you check that in your data. Next would be that there's no strategy or coaching. So we'll talk about Matt's data very quickly before I end off the video, but having the ability and understanding of maintaining your technique when you are at these maximal levels of fatigue, knowing how to pace the beginning parts of workouts so that you can have a bigger kick at the end, having an understanding of little things like in this workout specifically, getting into the rower quickly, being able to get your work pace up really quickly in your first couple pulls. All of those little things are super important in dictating success. So when you are doing these types of workouts, if you're self-directed, make sure you're paying attention. Do some video review, take your splits, do some analysis where you can get better. If you're a coach, make sure it's not just about making them hurt. You don't want them starting the interval and being like, oh yeah, you're gonna go and at this round you need to hold a 145, so why don't you start at a 145? Because it's then going to inhibit their long-term progress. So you need to make sure that you have some sort of coaching in the process to know how they actually execute this workout. And the final one is do not do this with high frequency. Forever, as long as I've been coaching in this space, I have always tried to tell people to do low intensity work, do movement work, build your base, and be kind of smart about your development and prioritize longevity. Now that being said, when you're getting ready for competition, your ability to be mentally tough is going to be one of the things that sets you up for success. So we're using this sparingly, but now is the time that we are kind of doing it as we're getting ready for the competitive season. We are starting to build that foundation of building the mental toughness in these super low complexity movements so that when we start our competitive cycle and we start doing this more sport practice, they've kind of peaked that system out before we go into competition mode. So use it sparingly, make sure you use it in times where it makes sense. If somebody's in an off season and they're trying to get healthy and just feel better, then like this pain cave type work is just doesn't really make sense. It doesn't align with their goals. If they're getting ready for quarterfinals, open, a big competition, this type of training tool can be super, super, super effective. Okay, so hopefully by this point, I've convinced you that this is an important style to integrate into your training. Let's just look at a couple quick things in the data that illustrate some of the points that I've already talked about. In this chart, I have basically the written down times from Matt's actual demo that's on YouTube. So I'm not gonna talk through all of the data because I feel like that would just get boring, but some of the major things that I see. First is the work to rest ratio. So if you look at his total time, the total time window in the first round was 2:37, and in the end it's 2:19, and as fast as is 2:08. So there's only a 30-second total discrepancy in the amount of time it took to do the work. But the total rest time that he had as a result of this condensing window goes from 1:23 down to 2 seconds in the last interval, which means as you get closer to the end of the workout, you go from like finishing and having a minute to get some water, let your heart rate come down, to frantically trying to finish your row, put the thing back in the handle and get back on the ground for the next set. So it moves very quickly from intervals into max effort metcons. So when looking through the data of this, Matt finished the workout. Matt's a semifinal level athlete and has been at big competitions like WFP around the world. But most of the data from quarterfinals level athletes through semifinal levels meant that most people were finishing about 7 rounds at the minimum. Now, whether you're finishing 7 rounds as an intermediate athlete or 13 rounds as an elite athlete, what you're all going to experience is at the end of the workout, this feeling of the rest window being completely compressed and your heart rate and your overall effort being near max and having to sprint to get through an interval. And when you get through that interval, the next interval is so challenging because you've kind of emptied the tank. And that is very, very clear in Matt's data here. His last timed round, which is the 12th round, if you make that through, the workout just says, okay, 13 is now for time. But his round right before the for time workout was 2:08. But in order to do that, he only had 2 seconds rest, and it meant that his final round slowed down by 11 seconds and bumped back up to 2:19, which was as slow as his 8th round as he was getting faster through the workout. So this kind of indicates that feel of like everybody's gonna go through that kind of pain cave moment where you like really gotta say, okay, am I gonna push through this interval? And if I do push through this interval, I'm gonna be all the way at my max effort limit of all of these systems, and I'm gonna need to convince myself, my mind, my body, to keep moving through the workout. So this workout construction is just a beautiful way to make sure that you elicit that maximal pain cave stimulus in a ton of different types of athletes. Other things to notice that we talked about, Matt's row pace moved from a 2:02 in the beginning down to a 1:47. So he got a lot faster as he was going. Even though his rest was getting condensed, he was going way faster to meet that time window. His burpees, even though it was only 10, went from 35 seconds down to 23 seconds in the slowest or in the fastest interval. So this is a reflection that Matt, as somebody who's very well trained in the sport, has a very good understanding of strategy, pacing, making sure that he's not doing this kind of like go out too hot, fall and let your system kind of crash and burn because you didn't appropriately pace. So Matt kind of has the strategic orientation as he's going through the workout to make sure that he can kind of prioritize eliciting max power when he's deepest into the pain cave, when the score is actually going to matter for him on the leaderboard. So that is the data that I think is relevant for looking at. You can also watch that entire demo video and we talk over the workout, some of the progressions. If you want to join us for this actual workout, you can do it. And we're running progressions. We just did it in the program yesterday, or depending on when this video comes out, Tuesday of this week. And we're gonna run progressions every single week until the end of the cycle before we move into our competition cycle of the next week. That is all I got on pain cave training. Remember, as you move forward, the tips that I talked about in terms of how to prescribe these and how to use them sparingly. Also remember, it is not the only differentiating variable of success. You should also train some of the fundamentals intelligently, like your movement, your basic strength, your skills, your conditioning. But at some point, your ass is gonna need to be tough, so this is a good style of workout that you could use. Peace.